Welcome. This is the Microsoft Office Developer Training Content Module, Microsoft Teams Development, Bots, Messaging Extensions, and Cards. In this module, we will go deeper into bots, messaging extensions, and cards than we have in other modules. If you are just starting out in Microsoft Teams development, please refer to the Training Content repo for an Introduction and Fundamentals course on Microsoft Teams development. This course will assume a base level of proficiency in the bot framework. My name is Paul Schafline. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Office Development. Our agenda for this module will be bots in Microsoft Teams, messaging extensions, and using cards in Microsoft Teams. We'll be focusing on capabilities that have been added to the Microsoft Teams platform in the fall of 2018. When discussing bots on Microsoft Teams, we're going to focus on the new capabilities around conversations, notification-only bots, and sending and receiving files. As you may already know, conversations is a series of messages that are sent between your bot and users of Microsoft Teams. There are different scopes for conversations. There is the Teams scope. This is also called a channel conversation, in which a message is posted to a channel in Microsoft Teams. Messages are posted by members or bots and are visible to all members in the channel. However, your bot cannot see every message that's posted to a Teams channel directly. However, you can query the Microsoft Graph API to find channel conversation messages. Personal scope is a conversation between a bot and a single user. This is sometimes called a one-on-one conversation, in which the only participants are the bot and the user. New in September 2018 is a group chat. This is similar to a channel conversation in that there's more than one user interacting with a bot. However, it's not in a channel conversation. The group chats show in the chat section of the Teams client application, not under a channel. It is important when you're writing a bot and interacting with users in Microsoft Teams to understand the context in which this is running. And in order to get the context, you need to respond to events that fire during the life cycle of a bot in a Microsoft team. When a bot is added or when certain events happen in the Microsoft Teams ecosystem, an activity object can be passed to your bot. You don't have to do any registration to get the events sent to your bot, but you do need to inspect the activity object that gets sent and act accordingly. The most important events are team member events, team member added and team member removed. The payload of this object, the payload object of these events includes the list of added or removed members. And this event fires when the bot is added to a team. And so the team member added event will fire with the team member added list containing the ID of the bot. You can tell if it's the ID of the bot by comparing the recipient ID with the team member added ID. And if they match, the bot was added to a team. When that happens, you should cache information from the activity object, such as the tenant ID, the team ID, and conversation IDs, so that you can respond to events or notify users later. In order for these messages to be started and maintained, you have to understand, or you have to have previously seen this information. So the team member event and its context are crucial to being able to cache this information and respond accordingly. New in the September 2018 timeframe is the reactions events, where a reaction is added or removed, such as a thumbs up on a message. Channel events and team events are unchanged from previously, which let you be notified or inspect the information about a team or the channels in a team. When the event is fired and the activity object that you receive, it contains the data of the current state. So you won't understand necessarily what the channel's old name was when it was renamed, but you will know what the new name is if you need this information in your application for other reasons. The team's context, as I mentioned, is crucial for having a well-rounded bot. When a message is sent to your bot, you can determine the context and various information about the context in different ways. What we're showing you here are a couple of different approaches to get the members or teams in a particular conversation. The members in conversation code snippet is showing that when a connection is made to Microsoft Teams, so the connector object in your bot can access the conversations collection, and I can get the members of a conversation. So I'm passing in a particular conversation ID, and it will then return to me the members participating in that conversation. Remember, there is a new scope now called group chat, and in the group chat, this is the way you can determine who's conversing in that group chat. A personal scope or a one-on-one conversation is easy to deduce, and a channel conversation is visible by members of a channel. But in a group chat, this is the approach you'll need to take to find the members participating in that conversation if that's something that you need. Note that there's an extension method off of the members object called as Teams channel account. This will provide the Microsoft Teams specific information about a user, such as their Microsoft Teams user ID, that you can then use to interact with the user. Again, sending one-on-one messages or starting conversations, as we'll see in a moment. Seeing the channels in a team, while you can capture every event that is fired, such as channel add and channel removed, you can also, with a the Teams connector client, you can then retrieve the channel list. And again, casting that to a Teams channel data object will get you information about the team, about the tenant, about the individual channels that are participating in this context. Where the context is helpful and where bots can provide some additional value is in proactive messaging. Proactive messaging is just a term used to describe the message sent by a bot to start a conversation. This isn't a response, but is rather starting a conversation. You can start a personal conversation if you have the user's information cached. That information can be cached either by querying the member list in response to an event, or saving information when a user mentions the bot, or if a user initiates a one-on-one conversation and you want to reply to it. Starting a channel conversation requires you to have a channel information cached, right? And so in order to have that information, again, you would be caching information from a previous interaction or in a conversation update event, such as the bot is added. You can then call the create conversations method to create that conversation, right? It is worth noting that Microsoft Graph has the ability to interact with conversations as well, and that information can be found in a different module. When notification-only bots, when a bot responds to a conversation in a channel, users can sometimes get an activity notification if they are following that channel. The information in a channel is highlighted to users as part of the Microsoft Teams functionality. But personal messages can also be sent into the activity feed. When you respond to your message, you can add a property that tells it you want to set it in the activity feed. Of note is that you have to have a text and summary properties on the message. This is new in the recent update. Message text has always been part of the message object. Summary information is a new capability, and if you want your message to be shown in the activity feed, you must include the summary as well as the text information so that the Microsoft Teams can render that information appropriately. If what you end up writing is a bot that is sending proactive messages and updating the activity feed but not responding to users, you can code that as an isNotification-only bot. You would want to do this to prevent confusion from users who are trying to start conversations or message the bot when you won't be replying to it. So in the bot manifest and the bots node, you can set the isNotification-only property, which would then suppress that @message capability as well as starting a conversation one-on-one. Another new capability available in Microsoft Teams is sending and receiving files. There are two different approaches you can do to send a file through a bot. What this means, of course, is that you can have a user be uploading or sending a file to the bot, and the bot can then process it as necessary. Or the bot can reply or send information in a file to a user. You can use the Microsoft Graph API. Files in Microsoft Teams are stored into the document library or the files library of the OneDrive of that group. And so Microsoft Graph provides access to OneDrive or root drive of a group or of a user. So of course you can use the Microsoft Graph API using the drive endpoint to obtain access to a folder for the user or for the group, get a reference to that file, and then post a message to a conversation with a card attachment that points to that file. That is certainly a valid capability. Another approach, though, is to use the Microsoft Teams API. When in a personal context, which is a one-on-one information, you can enable the message compose area, which we'll see further in the next section here. But I can attach a file to a message. A user can attach a file to a message, and when that file is attached, it is sent to the bot. What that really means, however, is that the Microsoft Teams client will provide a file picker experience in picking off of a local computer or off of the OneDrive of the current user. After the file is selected and sent, Microsoft Teams, if necessary, will store that file in the user's OneDrive or in the group OneDrive. And then it sends a message to the bot, that post activity, that has metadata about that file, including a content URL. The bot, if it needs to access the raw data of the file, can use that content URL and download the file and process it as necessary. So in effect, what you're doing is downloading a file from OneDrive. However, the Microsoft Teams client, as well as the Microsoft Teams API, facilitates that experience and makes it quite seamless. In order to enable sending and receiving files, again, you have to update your manifest in the bots node. You need to turn on the supports files property, set that equal to true. Note that it's a Boolean value, not a string. And then this will then help Microsoft Teams application handle that scenario where a user wants to send a file to the bot. So let's go do a demo and see sending and receiving files. In this demo, we're going to show a bot that can send and receive files. I'm in Microsoft Teams and I'm in a one-on-one conversation with my bot that I've already uploaded to the Microsoft Teams application. In the message window, you'll notice there are options down below. These are called messaging extensions, and there's one that is the paperclip. If I choose the paperclip, you'll see I then have the choices to say I want to send a file to this bot, either uploading from my computer or choosing from my OneDrive. I'm going to select upload from my computer, and I'm going to go up and create a real quick text file just for us to send something to that. And in that file, we're going to just put a couple lines of text in here just so that you can see that we can reread that file. So this is a text file in the demo. All right. So I have that content, and I'm going to then select that file. Microsoft Teams, you'll notice, has a progress bar going as it's now taking that file and it's sending it. What has happened at the moment, however, is it has taken that file from my local PC and it has uploaded it to OneDrive for the current user. I'm going to show that by switching over to the browser, and we'll go to the OneDrive for this user. I'm logged in as Megan, so we'll log in as Megan, and we'll then switch to OneDrive for Business for Megan. And here you'll notice there's a Microsoft Teams chat files folder. And in that, here's texting.txt that was uploaded about a minute ago. And if I open this file, you can see this is the text file in the demo. So even though we are, quote, uploading a document to the bot, that's not what's happening. It's being uploaded to OneDrive. Also notice that the text window is still available here. The message window is still open. I can still type information. The actual response isn't sent to my bot until I actually click the send option. And when doing that, you'll see you've shared testing.txt is the message from Microsoft Teams, and my bot has now responded that it received a file named testing.txt, and the first 25 bytes of the file say this is a text file in th. So you can see this file has been now sent to the bot. The bot was able to pull that file, open it, and look at it and do something with it. So what is happening here? I'm going to now stop the bot, and we can walk through what it was required for this to happen. So first thing I want to show is the root dialog. So the messaging controller routed a message to the user. Actually, we should probably see what that looks like. If I go to my ngrok tunnel, you'll see what I got was a message that had an attachment within a content type of a Teams file download. Here is the content object, and the content object has a download URL as well as a file type. And then it has content URL. You'll notice the content URL shows that it's in my SharePoint.com personal Megan, right? But however, the download URL has just the download.aspx with a token assigned to it. So I have two different URLs, one to get the object, the metadata from OneDrive, and one to actually download the document. So if I look at my bot here in my root dialog, I am now checking to see if what we got, if an activity has an attachment, and if the attachment counts is greater than 0, then I'm going to look and see, well, there's lots of types of things that are attachments. So before we can go on and say that this is a file, I want to actually look at that each attachment and look for that content type. And if you remember in my message here, I have the content type, which is this string of vnd.microsoft.teams.file.download.info. Since I'm running the Microsoft Teams bot SDK, it will then parse that information for me and return for me an enumeration value that says this is a file download info. Right? And so I can now say, if this is what I want to process that attachment. So if I look at my process attachment method, you'll see I'm going to make a message that I'm going to be replying with, and you can see the string here. And now as it's going through again doing some little defensive coding, and I'm going to then get this file download info object. And I took a shortcut that says if it's a text file, I'm going to read it. So I don't want to necessarily read as string if it's some type of binary file. So this is simply just doing the download of the file. You'll notice I get the download URL property from that card and make a call to OneDrive and say I want to download that content. And when it finishes, I want to just pull out the first 25 bytes and write that back. Obviously, a more full-featured bot would do something with this with the attachment. But again, I get an attachment. I want to check that the attachment type is a file download, and then based on the file type, the information that's provided, I can then act accordingly. So I'm going to restart my bot here, or my bot code, so I can go back and show about having the bot send the message to the user. And so in this talent management bot that we've created, there is the ability to get a resume, right? So if I type in resume and I want to give a name for the person that I want the resume, and if I send that message to the bot will then respond by sending a card. Now, sending a card works in a similar fashion. It's going to use OneDrive for Business. So before that can happen, the bot needs permission. So you need to reply to the bot, from the bot to the user, with a file consent card. Office Dev Talent Bot, my bot, needs permission to upload this file to, and so it's now saying here is the name of the file, and it's chopped off what's happening here, but it's checking and say, hey, Megan, does this bot have permission to upload this file? What it's going to be uploading to is OneDrive for Business. So I can, as Megan, I can choose allow or decline. If I allow that to happen, that message is then posted back to the bot, and the bot can then proceed. And in this particular example, it has now uploaded the Smith resume and is a text file, and now I have a file information card here. So now Megan can then open it online, download the file, or get a link to the file. Right? Let's go back to Megan's OneDrive. And if I go back up to the files, and now I'm going to refresh this page, this is what I'll end up with here is now when files come from the bot, they show in this applications folder, and here's the Office Dev Talent. So there's an applications folder, and a subfolder for the name of the bot. And in there you can see is the Smith resume along with all the files that have been sent before. Now, obviously this is not a very complicated file. This is just a resume for Smith. It was just, I will show you how we created that. But again, sending and receiving is using OneDrive for Business for that to work. I'm going to go back to my tunnel here and we can see the messages that have happened here. So the first one was the message John Smith that came into my bot, right? And so the response here has to go back and say, give it that file info card, and then the file consent card is then returned, right? So this invoke message, when Megan clicked the allow, an invoke message was sent back to the bot with the particular information, and we'll show you how that works. But what ends up happening here is that the value here is going to be action accepted, and then there's some information, right? Again, I get upload info similar to what we saw for download info. So let's go to the code and see how that. So in my in the message controller, so we have, this is where we're checking to see our dialog. I'm sorry, I went to, in the root dialog is where we're checking to see if what they've typed in says they want to get a resume for a particular user. If so, we're going to handle that command. And now here you'll see this is just showing us a pseudocode, if you will, of getting a file to send to the user. At some point, I'm going to want to know what file needs to be sent, and I would have some information that I need to probably store in state conversation data. I'm going to create a message with an attachment, right? And that attachment is going to be that file consent card. Now, when I send the file consent card, I give it a name of the file, and then I can have two data islands, if you will, or what we're calling data contexts. So I have an accept context, which means whatever value is put in the accept context will be returned back if the user clicks accept. So you'll notice here I said my accept context would be the file ID and a name. So if the user requested a resume for John Smith, I'm going to put John Smith in this context. When the accept button was clicked, that context came back to me. If you look here, here is my context, the file ID and the name. So that is the information that I can use to reply to with the actual file. Similarly, there is a decline context. On this particular example, I left it blank. There would be no information that I needed to do, but you could fill it out as well. You simply reply to a message with an attachment that we've seen. We'll talk about cards in general, but we would again send the card as an attachment, and then we're done. And now we have to then wait for the user to click accept or decline. And now the accept or decline comes through as an invoke, if you saw. So that's not necessarily a message that's posted to a dialog. That's an invoke. So we're checking to see if what they've sent is an invoke message in response to a file consent. And if so, we will then handle that. And so similar to what we saw before, we're going to then go through and get the information from my context as well as the information provided by Microsoft Teams. So I get my file consent card, that response that they sent, right? And then I'm going to pull into this file, from this file consent response, you'll notice I have an upload info object which has the upload URL. And so this particular bot is going to just generate a text file in memory and send it off, but you typically pull that information. Again, my accept context would have a file ID that I need to send, and I will then make an HTTP request doing a put operation to this upload URL. This is a OneDrive URL. If you go to the Microsoft Graph documentation and read about uploading files to OneDrive using the put operation, that's all documented explicitly how to do that. And so I sent a card that says I want to upload a file. You can then reply to that, accept or decline with that card, and that will then give you a URL that you can then upload. So that is the simple sending and receiving capability that you need to do for Teams. Moving on, we'll now cover the second section, messaging extensions. What we have to talk about with messaging extensions is the events and queries that Microsoft Teams can send to your bot, how to respond to those user requests, and then what was required in our app manifest for messaging extensions. As we saw earlier, activities have different types, and specifically for messaging extensions, the activity type is an invoke. There are 3 types of invoke events that can happen: a compose extension / query, compose extension / query setting URL, and compose extension / setting. A compose extension is the previous name of this technology. It has been renamed in recent. So what you'll see in the Microsoft Teams SDK is the compose extension prefix on these methods, but it's the same thing. This invoke activity is sent to the registered bot endpoint, just like any other activity. Right? And you would then use your combination of the Teams connector NuGet package to parse that invoke and then reply with the appropriate information. What you end up with are, first of all, query events, right? And so the idea around a messaging extension is that you are then helping the user to compose or to create a message that they will then post to a bot or post to another user or post to a conversation or a group chat, whatever the case may be. And so in order for the user to have rich information or the information they need as part of their message, they can then send a query message to your bot, and the expectation is that your bot would then query some back-end service and return a selection of items that match that query, and the user can then pick one of them and embed that into their message. So you define a query event. That query event is then sent to your bot. You can then make a call to the get compose extensions query data method, which will return to you the information that you define in your manifest. It should match, and as well as the value that the user chose for their query. You would then respond to that message with a message that has attachment of type list, and you would then send a list of adaptive cards, hero card, thumbnail card, or Office 365 connector card as appropriate to render the information that the user can then pick to send their message. Now, as you saw earlier, there are 3 different invoke messages. One is the query, but then we have these query settings and settings update. If there is some type of configuration experience that you wish to offer or that you require, you can include that in your manifest, and Microsoft Teams will then enable this ellipsis next to the compose extension. And the ellipsis context menu then has a settings link. The purpose around this, again, is for perhaps you need to provide prompt the user for some license key, or perhaps you need to do an authentication experience that the user would have to go through, or perhaps you want to then have settings that apply throughout this particular team. Remember, each application installed individually in each team, and so in each team maybe you want to have some type of configuration experience to limit your extension to a subset of data based on the team. Whatever the scenario may be, you can configure that. When that happens, the user will click on the settings, and Microsoft Teams will do that invoke with the onQuery settings URL. And then you will then return a URL of the settings page. Microsoft Teams will handle the opening of a pop-up window and the rendering of that URL in the page. Right? But you need to return what that URL should be. You would typically include query string parameters or some kind of state information so that when it's submitted, you can then handle accordingly. When the user completes that configuration dialog and they click the Save button, the onSettings Update invoke message will be sent. That would then your responsibility to then accept the information from that page and set cache storage or whatever is required for your extension as appropriate. So Microsoft will then give you an onSettings Update invoke with the information that you need to handle that. Again, it's your responsibility to do all that work. There are some restrictions around responding to these requests, right? So again, users have clicked a button and they're waiting for you to get back. So you must respond within 5 seconds to the response. Otherwise, they will get an error. Users will get an error that something went wrong and it didn't work. When you're responding to a messaging extension request, you will then actually send an HTTP response. This is different than what you see in most other bot methods, specifically the stuff that we showed earlier. If you remember earlier, we were doing a context.done or we're doing a context.post message, which is then making a call to the bot framework, and the bot framework is then surfacing the message up in the Teams client. Messaging extensions are different. This is your typical HTTP request response pair that you'll have to do. So you need to send an HTTP response directly from your controller that must have a status of 200. The content type must be of application/JSON. And then the response body has to be a valid compose extension object. And remember, the Microsoft Teams connector NuGet package has those base objects that you can then call the serialization on to compose a valid object. But again, remember, this is different. You're sending an HTTP response instead of posting a message back to the bot framework. To enable compose extensions or messaging extensions, you have to update the app manifest. You need to include the compose extensions node. The compose extensions node has the bot ID, so Microsoft Teams understands which bot will be responding to these messages. That would be the same bot ID that you had registered in the bot framework registration panel. And typically, we see people who put compose extensions in the same app manifest as the bot, so that when the bot is added, the compose extensions are added as well. However, that's not a requirement. You can do as you see fit. You can define the various scopes, and if you'll notice on there, we have the can update configuration setting to true. If it's true, it enables the ellipsis menu. If it's set to false, then that settings menu is not allowed. On the right-hand side, you see the command. And the commands are the things that define what should be shown to the user as well as what gets sent back to you. So you can have multiple commands in your messaging extension, so you have an array there. Each command has an ID. So in the example here, the ID is search command, and that search command will then be sent back to my bot. This is a search command. The title and description are displayed to the end user. Initial run controls what happens when the user first clicks on the icon to open the messaging extension. Do you want it to immediately run something, or do you want it to wait until the user fills out some information? And you can choose how you want that to work. And then you define the parameters that get sent back, right? And so if you define parameters, then when the messaging extension is invoked at the very top, you'll see the box for the user to type in. And the description will be like a tooltip or a placeholder text in the control for them. The user sees enter your search, the description and the title. The parameter name is sent as part of the invoke. So in the invoke, your bot will get the command ID, and it will get the parameter name as well as the value that the user typed in. That's the information, the collection of that information that you would then use to run the query and reply that information back to the user. So let's walk through a demo of that and then explore the code. In this demo, we're going to start a little bit different here. We're going to look at the manifest first. I've opened the manifest for my bot, and you'll see here in my compose extensions node, I've defined the extensions that I wish. I have my bot ID, and you'll see here the scope is in a team scope. This particular bot is a talent management. It's designed to help hiring managers and employees find positions and candidates. And so we're going to let them enter candidate information or position information into the conversation. So this bot has two commands. So you'll notice my commands here. I have one for search positions and a second one to search candidates. Right? One thing that I want you to point out here is that the initial run for positions is set to true, and for candidates it is set to false. So we can see the contrasting experience. Right? You'll then notice that I have different command IDs, search candidates and search positions. So my code can then understand what is going to be requested by the user. And then all the various prompts are there as well. This is already running, so I'm going to switch over to Microsoft Teams, and now I'm in a channel. And you'll notice here's my message box, and I have all the various icons below it. And then by clicking the ellipsis, you'll then see I have my bot listed here. Right? The ellipsis here has just the pin option. That is because I do not define the can update settings. I don't have the configuration enabled. Right? There's no configuration experience necessary in my bot. So there is no settings URL. When I choose this, you'll notice right away search position shows up, and search positions, because it's listed first, is shown on the right and the left, and because it is initial run to true, it actually ran right away to get a bunch of positions. Other commands are in a tab strip across the top, and you'll see here search candidates is set initial run false, and so I don't see a list of candidates, I get rather that prompt that we gave the user. So you see search candidates by name, and candidate name are the values that I did for my title and description. So, right? Now, the idea around a messaging extension, of course, is that I can say we need to hire someone to be a content writer, so I can then choose a particular position, and now the bot then returns with a card that is then rendered in here, and the cursor is ready for me to type in here. It says we need to and then sending the messages like any other experience, and now you'll see that information's in there. Notice this card has various options that you could do, see details and so on. Now I haven't wired that up yet, but the idea, of course, is that cards can do this, and it's in the message, it's in the conversation. If any particular user can then act on that as they see fit. So let's look at the code required to make this happen. I'm sorry, first we want to go back and look at the responses, requests and responses that came through, right? So here you'll notice this was the first one here that's called the invoke for compose extension / query, right? And in this particular one, we are, as I mentioned before, we're sending back an HTTP response, and you'll see here I have a compose extension object with a list, right? And here's the attachments and all the information that's needed. And so you'll see here a large collection of all the various items that were sent in, right? And so a lot of different, when it is going through back and forth, you'll see, so I have a lot of compose extension queries. That's what it was all happening here, right? And eventually we posted the message. So if we look now at the code, our messages controller, it will, of course, be handling that message as well, right? So we'll go back up to the top here. And so you'll notice here we have an invoke that's happening here. And so this branch is true. It's not a message, it's an invoke. And you'll notice down here we have the extension method that the Teams connector NuGet packages shows us is compose extension query. And since that returns a true, then we're going to then do our messaging extension here. As I mentioned before, we respond differently. When I get a message that is sent in, I'm invoking a dialogue, right? I'm doing a send async on the conversation of a dialogue, or perhaps I'm doing a context.post. You'll notice here we're not doing that. We are letting this fall through, and we're returning a create response, an HTTP response message with the OK, including my response here. So now we'll look at the method that we have to actually go through and do the query and return results to the user. First thing we're going to want to do is make sure we do some data validation. So we're going to make sure that the command ID is something, that the parameters are something. Did the user actually do the query as necessary? Or did nothing happen, right? Now what happens in this particular case, it's the first run, right? So on first run, I'm getting that first run parameter, so that's why this comes through to true, right? And then we're going to go through and do the look that we have to do here. If what the command that we're given was search positions and the parameter that we got was called initial run, then we're going to just go ahead and right away do the first 10 positions, right? If it's not the search run, someone had typed in a value, which I forgot to show you that, we can show that real quick, then you'll see there that we end up with that parameter. We can have to get the first parameter and pull that information out of there, right? At some point, though, we're doing a query to some type of system, and we're getting a collection of positions that we want to then return back. And so now we're just going to loop through each one and create a card. We'll talk more about cards in the next module, but in general, we're defining a JSON object that describes the information that we want to return, and then we're attaching that card to the message, right? So this attachment we're calling is a method that the Teams gave us to format this as a compose extension attachment. So my response is going to have 10 attachments, right? And then this 10 will simply be returned back in the message. And then conversely, you can see here's the search candidates command doing a similar type of operation here. This particular one, it has a hard-coded query string, but you'll notice that the information at the end of the day, I'm creating a card and I'm adding that to an attachment. and then returning that response. So let me real quick restart this again, and I wanted to show you doing a search on a particular position or candidate, right? So we'll go back in here. Now I've just started my IIS Express, so hopefully it won't time out on us. I'm going to invoke this, and we'll wait. And now you see the position keywords, and so I'm going to search for development. So if I type in development, and you'll see it refreshing as I went and did that. If I go back and look at the tunnel that things coming through here, you'll notice this. I'm taking the most recent one here, and if we scroll down, you'll notice here is the value that we're getting, search positions. The keyword is DEVEL. If I go back a couple earlier ones, you'll notice that this is the initial run was true, right? So first it was invoked with initial run true, and then here's the DEV, and I kept typing, and we come back with DEVEL. So you can see the information that is set here, right? And Teams is saying, I don't want anything more than 25, or if I'm on page 2. So this information is being sent to you. Again, you respond within 5 seconds using an HTTP response instead of posting back to the bot framework. And that is how we can then have provide the capability for our users to invoke our messaging extension to help create a message that they then post to a conversation. In the last section of this module, we'll talk about using cards in Microsoft Teams. You've seen a couple of experiences so far where we are doing cards, specifically as part of a conversation with the file upload and download, as well as a messaging extension. And so, of course, this is one way for us to provide a richer experience to users. So when I post to a conversation, obviously a text is the default for most users to type in information. But if we're going to be showing some information, we want to enrich that conversation, we want to use a card. And what we're showing here is just a subset of cards that you can do. New in September of 2018 is the adaptive card support. Microsoft Teams has full support for adaptive cards. It's really a customizable card that you can arrange in any way that you see fit. It can contain text, it can contain images and buttons and input fields for forms, and do text-to-speech for users. It is supported in Teams and Outlook and Windows Timeline and many other systems. So it's by far the preferred method to do is to send an adaptive card. Microsoft Teams, well, in general, adaptive cards are the user developer defines the structure and the data that needs to go in there, and the look and feel and the responsiveness is handled by the host system. So I just define the card and present that as an attachment, and Microsoft Teams will run that for me. If you wish, you still can use the native cards in Microsoft Teams. The two most popular that we would most likely see are the Hero card, which is showing you a large image. It wants to get eye-catching information, if you will. It's used if you're summarizing an article or something where the image is telling the story, right? There are functional types of cards, for example, a receipt card that's designed to show a receipt. If I'm using the bot to do some e-commerce and I want to show a receipt to the user, so it's a common layout. So instead of having to just force an adaptive card to do that, I can use a receipt card. And there's many other cards available as well if you look in the Microsoft Teams documentation to talk about what you can choose. But in general, adaptive cards are better for the developer reuse that's supported across many different products. In addition, you can use cards as part of messaging extensions, which we just saw in the previous module, where you will then reply with a list of cards in the particular card that you wish to choose. Again, choosing one that fits what you need to do. A hero card is going to show a big image as opposed to a thumbnail card that'll show a thumbnail image. And if you're showing a list of items, perhaps a thumbnail is a better approach than sending large images. But again, your information will dictate what you do. One thing to note as part of messaging extensions that you cannot have actions on your cards. Inside a messaging extension, the card is designed to show one of a collection of items that the user can then choose and then put into the message and type text around it, right? And so the actions that the only action that's supported in the messaging extension pop-up is the selection of a particular card that the user can then do. Now, we didn't show this in the previous module, but I render a card as part of the messaging extension, and I also then render the card as the actual message as well when the user selects one of them. So in the messaging extension, when I'm showing this list of items that the user can do, you do not want to include action buttons in there. If actions, if necessary, would go in the actual card displayed as part of the message. As I mentioned, Microsoft Teams supports adaptive cards, and in the adaptive cards specification, you'll see a lot of different choices for doing actions. Microsoft Teams supports only 3 actions, and they make sense and really will enable the vast majority of scenarios. First is the action.openURL. This will cause Teams to open a new window, a browser window with the URL specified. Right. The user can then see. The idea, of course, is to see a full screen of information. However, if you provide a URL, a deep link URL that you can generate for a tab, Microsoft Teams will then open up into that tab. The action.submit will submit a card. Right? And so you can define input fields on a card, and then the user will then fill out those fields and click the submit button. So it's similar to an HTTP form post. You can also include a hidden data packet or like hidden fields if you want to draw an analogy to HTML. That information can then be sent back. So an adaptive card can be used to gather information from the user. And the show card is the idea that I can have additional information shown. I can have a card that has a sub card, if you will, or a details card, and then the action would be to show the detail or toggle the detail card so that on first glance I can see the headline information. If I want more information, I can have an action to do that. These are the only 3 actions supported inside Microsoft Teams. Right? Microsoft Outlook has a different collection of actions that they support, but so there is some differing supportability based upon the applications. But if you think through that scenarios, it really makes sense based on the client application. They do what's appropriate for them. Again, these 3 scenarios certainly meet. These 3 actions meet all scenarios that you could generally come across. So let's go look at a little bit on how adaptive cards are rendered. Now the demo for cards in Microsoft Teams. First, let's review this card for the messaging extension that we just reviewed. What you'll see on the screen here is the method to create a card for a position. You'll notice we were creating a thumbnail card with a title, a subtitle, and a text. If I look back at the messaging extension, clicking the ellipsis and choosing my talent management bot, you'll see I only see a title and the text. Microsoft Teams automatically is filtering this information out. And by automatically, what I mean is the method that they've provided to us. When I actually choose the actual position, you'll notice that I get this extra line here that has information about the applicants and the hiring manager and so on. Looking back at the code, you'll notice that's the subtitle that is not necessarily shown. So we've created a thumbnail card with what we want users to post into the message. And when we invoke this message, if you remember, when we invoke this, we're creating the attachment, but then we're doing this toCompose extension extension method. And this is where the code from the NuGet package from Microsoft Teams is helping us to help our users by showing a subset of information into the list for the Compose extension, but yet the full card can be rendered when it is chosen. Now there's another use of cards that we can do. So for example, if I'm in a channel and I want to have a discussion about a particular candidate, our particular bot lets us get candidate details. So I'm going to request that. And so requesting the candidate details for John Smith for a certain role, you'll notice that our application is generating some random information in it, and it's showing the John Smith and in a particular role, the date they applied, a lot of information. Now you'll notice here's a little grid of information, if you will, of a table, as well as a people card for various folks and some other information here we can see here, right? Including a set interview date. And when I choose set interview date, you'll notice it's creating a date, and I choose, there's a date picker, and I can pick the one I want and click OK, and that card is submitted. So you see here a very full-featured, rich experience for me to get information about somebody, interact with those, see the information I need, and right here in line, in the conversation, do all that kind of work that I need to see. This is done using an adaptive card. So now if we look back into our code to see what's happening here, this is a response to the candidate details. So the candidate details is then invoking the send candidate details message. And as we said before, it's just doing some random lookup of data. But you see here we have an adaptive card. There is a NuGet package for adaptive cards that's issued by Microsoft. And so I've added that adaptive card package to the project. This gives me the ability to build the card that I want in code and then just render it. It ends up being rendered as a JSON object, but this lets me do this in code. So looking in detail at what's being built here, you can see here I have an adaptive card, and in the body I have a list of elements. And what does that mean? So a list of elements. So the first element is the header. Right? And in the header, I'm including the name and the position that the person is working for. So if I look back at my card, you'll see the name is John Smith, ABC. That's my header. And you can see here it's set to be bolder, large text, just as you would expect to see in a rich thing. Below the header, we have an adaptive column set, right? And in the adaptive column set, you'll see here has two columns with the width is set to auto. And if the first one's set to auto and the second one is set to stretch to fill the width here. So I have two columns of information. You can see one is the picture, one is the information about who that picture is, right? So you'll see further here, we have a URL to a profile picture, and we say that it's the style of person and small. Microsoft Teams automatically renders the circle image like we would expect for user profile images just throughout Office 365 without us having to do any of that work ourselves. And you'll notice here we have the second column has a text block where I'm just having as a string of text and tell it I want to do a word wrap. That's correct. And below that, we'll put the current role. And you notice here it says is subtle equals true. That's yet another styling directive I can give it. And notice that the current role marketing manager is a shade of gray instead of black. That's the subtleness that's included with the adaptive card rendering. Right. And then further down, we have another, this is a full screen text block, if you will, that has the candidate biography. And below that, we have fact sets. And so now a fact set is this table of information that we have right in the middle of the card. Applied to interview date, hires, and then no hires. That is a fact set, and this lets me put any number of pieces of information in the card. Microsoft Teams will handle the rendering of that for me. I don't have to worry about the width and column and word wrapping. I just say I have X number of columns. So you see, for example, here I have facts set. The column 1, I'm just having a new set of facts, and that one has, so column 1 has 2 facts, column 2 has 2 different ones, and again, those are just rendered for me automatically. Right. And then lastly, when I get into the buttons, right? So if I scroll down, look at the bottom here, below that I have the referrals and then these couple of buttons. So if we scroll down past the referrals, which we end up with a card action. So the first one is a show card action. We talked about this before where it lets me, when I click on it, initially it's rendered, there's nothing here. I click set interview date, it opens up the value. Add comment works very similar in that I don't see it initially, but when I click on it, I see it. That's the show card action, kind of a toggle. Right. And so this show card action for set interview date is then going to show a card. Well, what card is it going to show? So what you'll see here is an embedded card, another adaptive card, same object that I did for my parent, but in this card I'm going to have a little bit less information. I have an adaptive element, and this particular one is a date input. But I simply declare a date input, the date picker is rendered for me automatically. Right? And then I have a data input and a submit action with the title OK. The set comment works very similarly. It's a show card action. It has a child card. This particular one is a text input with a placeholder for let me to add a comment. So that information is taken care of for me automatically, and it lets me put in the information that I deem necessary. Okay. Is multi-line gives us that larger box, and again with the OK button. And so I've created 2 different adaptive actions. I add those actions to the card, and then I simply return that card, and Microsoft Teams then goes on and does the rendering for me. Right. If we look back at what's happening here, you'll see a couple times when we rendered these cards, I was rendering a URL for images, so Teams was making that collection for me. If I look here at the message for the date, when I scheduled the date, you'll see here the value is being returned back here. So what ends up happening when I click that message, I get a message posted back to my bot, and now I need to understand that this message is coming through as part of a response to an adaptive card, right? Well, that's because if I look, there is no text. You notice there is no text as part of this message, but I do have this channel value with the interview date. And this will then match what I have in my code for the interview date, my text right here, the ID here, right? And so that lets me capture data, post that data back to to my bot, and I could handle that accordingly. Now, obviously, this example doesn't do anything with it, but it lets us work that. So cards is certainly make a much richer experience. I encourage you to explore adaptive cards, provide information like this to interact with your users rather than just sending them text or expecting them to type in a set of commands that can be somewhat difficult to understand. We can give them a form, let them fill out the form, and process the information there directly. So that now concludes our module. We talked about using cards in Microsoft Bots. We talked about using messaging extensions, and we talked about adaptive card support. I hope you found this information helpful. Thank you.